Last winter, my friend Colin and I decided to spend a week in a Henry deep within the forested wilderness of Alaska. It seemed like the perfect way to escape the monotony of our small town lives, a chance to breathe fresh air, enjoy nature, and unwind from the noise of civilization. The Henry was about a 2-hour drive from my house, tucked away in a remote area far from any other signs of life. Colin had stumbled across the listing online, advertised as a secluded spot boasting breathtaking views and the comfort of a wood-burning stove to keep us warm. The thought of snow-covered trees and peaceful nights by the fire sounded like a dream come true. So we packed our bags, loaded up my truck, and set off early one afternoon, eager for the adventure ahead. The drive started off uneventfully, with smooth roads and light conversation. However, as we got closer to the Henry, the road narrowed significantly. It was less of a road and more of a trail, cutting through the dense, towering forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the pristine blanket of snow. The Henry itself was small but cozy. It featured a single bedroom, a tiny but functional kitchen, and a fireplace that looked like it had weathered many winters. Surrounding it was an ocean of towering trees, their branches heavy with snow, and an almost suffocating silence. After unpacking our gear and settling in, Colin suggested we take a walk to stretch our legs and explore the area before it got too dark. The forest was unsettlingly quiet. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet, but rather a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that makes you feel as though you're being watched. Our boots crunched through the snow as we followed a narrow, winding path between the tall pines. That's when we heard a scream. Faint at first, it was just a distant cry carried by the wind. Colin and I froze, exchanging nervous glances. Then it came again, louder and unmistakably human. The sound sent a chill down my spine. It was a scream that conveyed pure terror, raw and desperate, like someone was in serious trouble. "We have to check it out," Colin said firmly. He was always the braver one, or maybe just more reckless. Every instinct I had told me to turn back and pretend we hadn't heard anything, but the idea of leaving someone out there in need of help weighed heavily on me. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we followed the sound, our footsteps quick and uneven in the deep snow. The screams grew louder as we ventured deeper into the forest, and soon we spotted a faint light in the distance. It was another Henry, much older and more dilapidated than ours. The windows were grimy, and the sagging roof strained under the weight of accumulated snow. The light inside flickered, as if coming from a fire or a lantern. We approached cautiously, the screaming abruptly cutting off as we got closer. The silence was replaced by a low, muffled sound, like someone crying or struggling to breathe. Colin gestured for me to stay back as he crept toward one of the windows. Using his sleeve, he wiped away a small patch of frost on the glass and peered inside. The look on his face when he turned back to me is something I'll never forget. His eyes were wide, his face pale as the snow surrounding us. "There's a guy tied to a chair," he whispered. "And another man. He's wearing a mask. He's got a knife." My heart plummeted into my stomach. My legs felt like they had turned to jelly, and for a moment I couldn't move. Colin began backing away from the window, his movements slow and deliberate, when a voice suddenly cut through the cold air behind us. "What are you doing?" We spun around, and there he was, a man standing just a few feet away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy coat and snow boots. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could feel his eyes on us, sharp and cold. For a moment, none of us moved. Without a word, Colin grabbed my arm, and we bolted. The man shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. The forest blurred around us as we ran, our breath visible in the frigid air. Behind us, I could hear the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps, relentless and gaining on us. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't dare look back. We reached our Henry and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, we just stood there, panting and staring at each other. Then we turned off all the lights and peered out the window, expecting to see the man charging toward us, but the forest was still. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Colin grabbed his phone and called the authorities. The wait for their arrival felt like an eternity, but eventually we saw the flashing red and blue lights piercing through the darkness. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. We hurried outside to meet them and recounted everything: the screams, the tied-up man, the masked figure, and the guy who had chased us. They didn't seem entirely convinced, but agreed to investigate the other Henry. We led them back through the forest, our flashlights slicing through the oppressive shadows. When we arrived, my stomach twisted. The place was empty. There was no light, no screaming, no sign of anyone. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the room was bare except for a broken chair in the corner and a thick layer of undisturbed dust on the floor. The officers promised to continue their search and instructed us to stay in our Henry for the night. We didn't sleep at all. Every sound made my heart race, and I kept picturing the masked man out there, watching us from the shadows. 2 days later, the authorities called to inform us that they had apprehended both the masked man and the victim. They didn't provide many details, only saying that they had found them and that the situation had been resolved. The officer on the phone sounded uneasy, as though there was more to the story he wasn't telling. When I pressed for answers, he simply said, "It's better if you don't know." That was enough for me. Colin and I packed up and left the Henry that same day, cutting our trip short. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt wrong, like it was hiding secrets we were never meant to uncover. Even now, back home, I can't shake the memory of that night, the screams, the chase, the masked man. It's all burned into my mind. Sometimes, late at night when I'm lying awake, I think about that voice in the forest, low, cold, and demanding. "What are you doing?" Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. It was January 2019, and I was living in a peaceful neighborhood in California. That winter was unusually frigid, and the news stations were issuing warnings about a rare heavy snowstorm making its way toward us. Snow in this part of California was almost unheard of, so it felt strange to see the white flakes starting to coat everything. I had always associated California with sunny skies, but that night the entire world seemed to transform. Everything was blanketed in white, as though a massive paintbrush had swept across the landscape, covering it in thick snow. My bedroom was on the second floor of our house, and I woke up around 3 a.m., groggy and needing to use the bathroom. The house was utterly silent, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive, like the snow outside was absorbing all sound. Swinging my legs off the bed, I glanced toward the window to check how much snow had accumulated. Earlier in the day, I had been excited about the storm, eager to see how the neighborhood would look under a pristine white layer. When I pulled back the curtain, I was stunned. The snow was deeper than I'd ever seen it before, piled high past the curb, completely smooth and untouched. The streetlights cast a faint glow over the snow, making it shimmer faintly in the darkness. It was beautiful, almost magical, a serene stillness with no cars, no people, just the undisturbed snow. After using the bathroom, I decided to go downstairs for a drink of water. The cold tiles of the bathroom floor sent a shiver through me, but I brushed it off as I walked down the stairs. I turned on the kitchen light and grabbed a glass from the cabinet. The house felt unusually empty, and I chalked it up to the snowstorm. It seemed to make everything quieter than usual. After finishing my water, I stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness of the kitchen light. That's when I heard it. A soft click came from the direction of the front door. My first thought was that it must have been a branch tapping against it, driven by the fierce wind outside. Maybe something had blown against the house. Shrugging it off, I turned off the kitchen light and started back upstairs. The stairs creaked slightly under my weight, just as they always did. When I reached my bedroom, I couldn't resist looking out the window again. Something was different this time. There were footprints in the snow. Fresh ones. They started right at the edge of my driveway near the house and trailed off toward the neighbor's backyard. I stared at them, trying to process what I was seeing. It had only been a few minutes since I last looked outside. How could someone have made those tracks so quickly without me hearing a thing? I squinted, trying to trace the footprints. They didn't loop back or continue further. They simply vanished behind the neighbor's house, as though the person had walked straight into thin air. A strange uneasiness settled over me, but I tried to push it aside. It was probably just a teenager messing around in the snow, I told myself. Maybe someone cutting through backyards is a shortcut. It wasn't a big deal. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept glancing out the window, watching the snow and waiting to see if anyone returned. The stillness of the night seemed almost oppressive. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. When I went downstairs, I found my mom and dad in the living room. They both looked upset. My mom was sitting on the couch, wringing her hands together, while my dad paced back and forth across the room. "What's wrong?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My dad stopped pacing and looked at me with a serious expression. "Your mom's gold jewelry set is missing," he said. That jewelry set was precious. My dad had gifted it to my mom on their wedding anniversary. It wasn't just expensive, it held deep sentimental value. My mom rarely wore it, preferring to keep it safely stored in a small wooden box in their bedroom. "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How could it be gone?" "We don't know," my dad replied. "We didn't hear anything, but it's gone." Suddenly, I remembered the footprints in the snow. My heart began to race as I told them what I had seen the night before, the fresh tracks leading from our house to the neighbor's backyard. My dad frowned and immediately decided we needed to check the CCTV cameras we had installed around the house. We all rushed to the small monitor connected to the cameras. My dad rewound the footage to the time I had gone downstairs for water. At first, everything appeared normal. The camera facing the front door showed nothing but falling snow. The backyard camera was the same. But when my dad switched to the footage from the kitchen camera, we all froze. The video showed me walking into the kitchen, turning on the light and pouring myself a glass of water. But in the corner of the screen, near the doorway leading to the dining room, there was movement. A man. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. He stood perfectly still, half hidden by the doorframe, his head tilted slightly as he watched me. He was watching me the entire time I was in the kitchen. I hadn't noticed him at all. My mom gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. My dad muttered a curse under his breath. We rewound the footage over and over, trying to make out the man's face, but the camera quality wasn't good enough. The image was too blurry to capture any details. The man must have slipped out while I was heading back upstairs. Maybe the click I had heard earlier was the front door opening and closing. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, they reviewed the footage but said it wasn't clear enough to identify the intruder. The officers searched outside following the footprints, but the snowstorm had started again, covering the tracks. They advised us to be more cautious, lock all doors and windows, and upgrade our security system. Beyond that, there wasn't much they could do. No leads, no answers. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the footage. How long had he been in our house? Had he been watching me the whole time? What would have happened if I had noticed him? The thought sent chills down my spine. It was December in Minnesota, and the entire world outside my window was cloaked in a pristine layer of snow about a foot thick. Everything felt so eerily quiet, as though the snow had muffled the entire neighborhood. My parents were out for the evening at a bar, and my brother was spending the night at a friend's house. This left me alone in the house, but that didn't bother me much. In fact, I enjoyed the peace and solitude. I was curled up on the living room couch with a thick blanket wrapped around me, the kind that felt like a warm embrace on such cold nights. The TV flickered in front of me, casting a soft glow that illuminated the otherwise dark room. I wasn't really paying attention to the show, more so letting the noise fill the void. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall marked each passing second, blending seamlessly with the low hum of the TV. I had just finished a bag of chips, crumpling the empty packaging in my lap, when I heard it. A faint knocking sound. It came from the basement. At first, I brushed it off, reasoning that it was probably the old pipes. Our house, after all, was old and prone to strange noises, especially during the winter months when the cold made everything creak and groan. But this sound was different. It wasn't random or sporadic like the usual house noises. It was deliberate, soft, but steady. Curiosity tugged at me, and despite my better judgments, I decided to investigate. Wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a cape, I ventured toward the basement door. The wooden floor felt icy against my sock-clad feet, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to grasp the cold handle. With a quick turn, I opened it and flipped the light switch, peering down the stairs. The light flickered for a moment before holding steady, casting long, exaggerated shadows along the walls. Taking a deep breath, I began my descent, each step creaking loudly under my weight. The basement was dimly lit, and the faint smell of dust and old cardboard filled the air. Everything appeared as it should. Boxes were neatly stacked in corners. An old desk covered in papers sat against the far wall, and a few plastic bins were tucked near the shelves. Nothing seemed out of place. I walked around the basement, my eyes scanning the small, fogged-up windows for any sign of movement or a draft. There was nothing, just stillness and silence. Convinced that my mind had played a trick on me or that the noise was merely snow shifting against the house, I shrugged it off and made my way back upstairs. Closing the basement door behind me, I returned to the couch, trying to shake off the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. 5 minutes passed, and I had just begun to relax again when I heard it, a loud crash, this time from the basement. The sound was sharp and unmistakable, followed by what I could only describe as a door slamming open. My heart raced as I sat bolt upright, my eyes fixed on the basement door. Unlike before, this was no faint or dismissible noise. It was real, clear, and urgent. For a moment, I froze, debating what to do. The house, which had felt so peaceful earlier, now seemed too quiet, the shadows in the corners darker and more menacing. My palms were cold and clammy as I forced myself to stand. I tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe my brother had come home early without letting me know. Maybe he was trying to scare me as a joke. Clinging to that possibility, I called out his name, my voice trembling. "Ryan? Is that you?" Silence. 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 I called again, louder this time, but the only response was the faint hum of the basement light. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I approached the basement door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob and opened it. The stairs stretched downward like a tunnel into an abyss. The air felt noticeably colder as I descended, and the light flickered again, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. When I reached the bottom, my stomach dropped. The basement was in complete disarray. The desk drawers were yanked open, and papers were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Boxes that had been stacked neatly in the corners were toppled over, their contents spilling out in chaotic heaps. The plastic bins near the wall were overturned, their lids lying several feet away. It was as though someone had been searching for something with frantic determination. But the worst part was the back door. It was wide open, the glass fogged up from the freezing air pouring in. Snow had blown inside, forming a thin, glittering layer on the floor near the threshold. And there, leading out into the backyard, were footprints, deep, clear, and fresh. They disappeared into the snowy night, vanishing beyond the faint glow of the backyard light. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in my basement while I was upstairs, blissfully unaware. The realization made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me, and I bolted to the door, slamming it shut and locking it as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. Grabbing my phone, I fumbled to dial my parents. When my mom answered, I could barely get the words out, my voice quivering as I tried to explain what had happened. She told me to stay put and assured me they were on their way home. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside to follow the footprints while my mom stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, trying to keep me calm. I watched from the window as my dad's boots crunched through the snow, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He followed the tracks over the fence and onto the road behind our house. A few minutes later, he returned, shaking his head. The footprints ended at the road. Whoever it was had likely gotten into a car and driven away. The police arrived shortly after. They walked through the basement, taking notes and searching for signs of forced entry. Strangely, there were none. The back door hadn't been broken. It had simply been unlocked. My dad swore he had locked it earlier, but perhaps it hadn't latched properly. The officers speculated that it might have been a random burglary, someone targeting our house because it appeared empty. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than that. The way everything had been rifled through so meticulously made it feel personal, as though whoever had been there was searching for something specific. The thought haunted me for weeks, and even now I can't look at the basement door without feeling a chill run down my spine.